Welcome to ExplainerCast, episode 25. I'm your host, Dave Smith.
And this is Shane Swenson.
This is ExplainerCast, and we have some explaining to do, so let's get into it. Today, we are continuing on a slight detour from our supposedly two-part series around color perception, and we're going to expand the scope and talk a little bit about human visual perception more generally beyond just the scope of color. And we're going to now move into trilogy territory, whereas before we were, I don't know, what's the trilogy equivalent of a two-part series? A bilogy?
I don't know. Yes.
I don't know
a binary. Yeah.
A binarology? I don't know. Anyway, so we're going into part 3 of 2 now on human visual perception.
Yeah, we start counting at 0 as engineers, and I guess we forget to stop as well. So
yes. Oh, perfect.
But yeah, Dave, as I kept digging into how we see things, and this ties a little bit back to some things I'm thinking about outside of this, maybe at my real job, where we're trying to figure out the best way to display images to people. I just keep being surprised at how awesome human vision is. And so I wanted to go a little bit more into that today, and we'll shift from looking at the way we see color, or we perceive color, to the way that we perceive structure, the way we see things like lines and edges and objects, which is really, of course, the big point of our vision system. And it's really awesome, and hopefully we can get into some of the cool details today.
I am super excited. We did a little bit of a preview on this. My mind was already blown in the pre-show, so I'm just fully expecting to have it oozing out of my ears by the time we're done today.
Sounds good.
Where should we begin?
Yeah, so maybe we should just begin with, maybe we start with the goal. Like, the goal is essentially to receive the light that's coming from our world and make sense of it. And so we talked last time about color, where we were discerning different wavelengths of light, and we had our different sensors that were essentially sensitive to different wavelengths, and then our brain would combine the amount of stimulus that each of those different sensors, specifically the cone cells in our eye, detected to select a color. But the reality is we don't just select overall color. We don't just say, oh, it's kind of bluish outside, or it's kind of greenish right now, but we actually can see the structure of the objects in our field of view. And so I think it's worth talking about how that works from a physics standpoint and from a biology standpoint.
Yes.
And the crazy thing here is the way that our eye works is surprisingly similar to the way that devices we've engineered, like cameras, also work. And it's really cool to see the analogs even between the biological embodiment in our eye and then the more physical or mechanical embodiment that we've created, like a digital camera.
It's almost like one was copying the other, but I just don't know which direction.
Exactly. Yeah. They've certainly converged onto similar solutions. So maybe if, what do they say? Imitation is the greatest form of flattery. So we've paid homage to biology, at least.
For sure.
And so to frame the problem, the world that we operate in has light rays going in every direction. And I think for this discussion, we'll mostly think of light in terms of particles called photons that travel in straight lines, and we can represent them just as rays, which is a directed line in our three-dimensional world. And the idea of a camera is to capture some of the light that's coming into the camera and to then perform a function called focusing to bring essentially all the light rays that originated from the same point in the scene to a common point where they can be measured by the sensor. And so when we're looking, like I'm looking out a window right now, and if I look out this window, I can see different objects. I can see buildings, I can see plants, I can see rocks. And each of those objects has light hitting it from the sun.
Mm-hmm.
And some of that light's absorbed. Some of that light is then transmitted, either reflected or maybe there's some other processes, but there's light as a result coming away from each of those objects. And generally that light is going in kind of every possible direction from those objects. So most of that light that's, say, hitting like a stone out my window, most of the light that's being reflected by that stone is actually not coming to my eye. It's going somewhere else.
Yeah, most of it will never be seen by a human eye.
That's true. Yeah, most of it's just going right back out into space. And the bit that's coming to my eye, this is the part that's kind of the first thing we have to think about is there are multiple pathways from a point in the scene I'm looking at into my eye, because my eye has a circle, an aperture called the pupil that allows light to come into the eye, and that's a circle with a certain size. And so slightly different pathways, some hits kind of the top of my pupil, some the bottom, some the left, some the right, some in the center. And then just past my pupil, I have a lens, which is kind of a round object that's thicker in the middle and thinner at the edges, a lot like a magnifying glass, that essentially refracts or bends the light coming into my eye so that all of the light that originates at the same point in the scene outside my window, those rays of light that hit various parts of my lens converge back to a common point on the inside of my eye, on the back part of the eyeball called the retina. And this is what allows one of the sensing elements in my eye, we have two kinds called rods and cones, to then detect the intensity of the light, how much light's actually hitting that spot. And as we've talked about in the previous episode, what color is that light? Like what wavelength is it, or what set of wavelengths is it, based on how much it stimulates the different types of color sensing cones in my eye. And the lens has this really amazing property that for each point kind of in a two-dimensional grid in front of me that's transmitting light towards my eye, those light rays will take a slightly different path, and they'll focus and converge on a slightly different spot on the inside of my retina. And so the same thing happens with the digital camera. You have a sensor, which is like a grid of individual picture elements, and when you focus the image, different parts of the scene in front of your camera, the light coming from those is then focused to different locations on that sensor. And typically it's kind of a reverse, like the image that's focused is going to be upside down relative to what you see in the scene outside of the camera or the eye. And then we process it either in the camera or in our brain to flip it right side up in terms of how we perceive the scene.
Yes, and can I just tell a little story from my childhood about this, where I first encountered this phenomenon?
Sure.
Okay. In high school, I worked in technical theater, and one of the things we did was we worked with lighting. And our lights that lit up the stage, they would shine from these catwalks up on the ceiling, and they would shine down on the stage and light up the scenes. Well, inside some of these lights, we had these lenses, and they were big. They were about the diameter of a dinner plate and about a few inches thick of just clear glass shaped like a lens, right?
Yeah.
Like a convex shape. And one day I was just holding one of these lenses, and I don't know why this never occurred to me in the past that this is exactly how lenses work, but I was holding it kind of parallel to a light fixture in the ceiling, so flat face up, or maybe the curved side up, but not perpendicular to the ground. And I looked I was holding it like maybe 6 inches off the desk that I was sitting at. And I looked down at the desk below the lens, and I happened to notice, and I just feel so dumb that I didn't realize this was happening, but a perfect image of the light fixture from the ceiling was being projected onto my desk, as if my desk was like a movie screen showing a picture of something up above. And I was like, what the heck? This is crazy. And so then I realized that if I kind of darkened the area where it was projecting into by like wrapping some black construction paper around the circumference of the lens and creating like a tube, a dark tube down onto the desk, that I could peek inside there from like, peel back some of the paper and peek inside, and I could see the whole ceiling.
Yeah.
And so this is kind of the silly part, but it came time in my physics class to do some like project for the class. And so I decided to borrow this lens from the theater department. And yes, I did return it. And I constructed this thing that you could put on your face with this big like dinner plate shaped lens in the front, and then a bunch of like black construction paper and cardboard behind it. It almost looked like a big, really awkward VR goggle set. Except all it would do was that it would then be transmit onto a thin piece of white paper in front of your eyes the image that it was looking at, except it was upside down.
Yeah.
And so And so I walked around with this thing on my face to see if I could actually walk with this upside down image. And it was hilarious. So I kind of branded it as like this, the amazing optical, reverser thing where you put this on your face and you walk around and everything looks upside down and backwards. And it was just so cool. And I just got super excited about that. But come to find out, that's exactly what's happening inside your eyeball based on what you just described as light passes through this little lens behind your pupil.
Yep.
Made out of clear proteins that are like crystalline, so they kind of are like glass almost. And sure enough, there's this image that's being projected just like that image from my theater lens, but now it's being projected onto the back of the inside of my eyeball on the retina.
Yeah, and basically you made a camera. You didn't necessarily have film, or something photosensitive to capture the image with, but what you constructed is a camera when you did that lens and dark space and then, an image plane behind it to capture the image or project the image. That's super cool. I was even thinking a couple other things as a kid now that this is dredging up memories. So another example of the focusing effect is if you take a magnifying glass and you angle it so that the sun is shining through it, and you make a smallest possible spot you can on a piece of paper. With the properly sized magnifying glass, you can start the paper on fire pretty fast because you've concentrated all that energy.
See, now that I definitely discovered as a younger child.
Yes.
With magnifying glasses.
So that's focusing. That's taking all of that light that's hitting, that's reaching that magnifying glass and bringing it all down to one point. Now it's, again, not what we want. We don't want something that strong hitting our image sensor, which is why we don't point our eyes or digital cameras at the sun without something protective in the way, because you don't want to do that to your eye.
Yeah.
Then the other thing I was thinking about that helps you sort of think about what a camera does without having to understand the lens is something called a pinhole camera. And we used these when we went to view one of the solar eclipses. I think it was, a year ago, a little over a year ago, is you just put a hole in a piece of paper or in like a paper plate or something like that, punch a small hole in it, and then let the sunlight shine through that and then hit something behind it, like another piece of paper or maybe just the ground. And if the pinhole is small enough, it essentially only lets light through a relatively small amount of light rays from each object through. And so you don't actually need to focus because you don't have a wide range of directions of light rays coming from the same object that can pass through the pinhole. It essentially selects like one or a small number of light rays that are all kind of clustered. And so it's naturally going to be in focus. The problem is you have very little light coming through. So you either need to make what's behind the pinhole extremely dark, and people have done this. Like you can again, make a very dark box, kind of like what you did, and just put a pinhole in it and shine it at a relatively bright scene, and you'll actually get the image from the scene projected inside. Or in the case of the sun's very bright, and so it comes through just fine. And as the eclipse was taking place, you could see the sun sort of get a chunk taken out of it by the moon.
Yeah.
As it changed its visual shape into a crescent essentially. So combining those two ideas of using a lens to focus and like a pinhole or a pupil or some kind of aperture to just accept light coming through and then projecting it onto a surface inside an otherwise light-proof object, which you built with construction paper, which your eye naturally has. There's only one direction for light to get into your eye, and that's through your pupil, through your lens. Then you can capture this image on the sensor on the backside. And so that's exactly what our eye does, just like a digital camera.
Awesome.
And it has a few resulting really interesting properties, again, many of which are shared with digital cameras. Maybe the first one, since we've been talking about pupils a little bit, is we do need to control essentially like the brightness.
Yes.
If you have too much light coming in and being focused, like extreme case, looking at the sun, you're just going to saturate the cone cells in your retina's ability to sense what there's, light versus dark. And so our pupil naturally shrinks. Our iris is the tissue around the pupil, that gives you the color of your eye, and the pupil is that black area in the middle. And so it'll shrink your pupil down so that less light comes through in a bright scene. And then if you're in a dark area, then your pupil will expand, allowing more light through. with the goal being to give the right amount of light to discern contrast between the individual cone cells and the rods as well that are more for your light dark vision.
So Shane, with your pupil expanding and contracting, is that strictly about volume? Does that change the scene or the size of the scene that you're able to perceive?
As far as I know, to a first order, it does not change like your field of view, like how wide of a scene you can see.
Mm-hmm.
There are a couple of effects. When your pupil is fully dilated, meaning it's very large, you're asking your lens to focus a broader diversity of light rays to a common point. And that's a harder task. And I think human visual perception as a result, when your pupil's very wide, it's just harder to focus perfectly. And so things will get a little bit blurrier, or you'll have a little less fine detail you can resolve.
I see.
On the other extreme, when the pupil is made super small, you get some quantum or wave-based effects called diffraction, which is when any type of wave passes through a very small opening, it kind of naturally spreads out on the other side of the opening. And when it passes near an edge, like the edge of your pupil, it kind of spreads out as it goes past that. And the result is that also impacts your maximum level of detail that you can perceive. So there's kind of a sweet spot, which is an in-between state where you're not trying to focus too many disparate light rays with a very large pupil, but you're also not suffering these diffraction effects with this tiny opening. And my understanding is that human like visual accuracy in terms of like the level of detail we can perceive or acuity is maximized in this kind of intermediate state of your pupil.
Okay. Interesting.
So yeah, it's just a cool natural mechanism for kind of light to dark, and it's happening all the time. Like you notice you step outside and it's bright, and then you kind of adjust a little bit later, or you step.
Yeah, and it's not instantaneous, right? Like it could take a good minute of kind of blinking and rubbing your eyes a little.
Yeah, exactly. And some of that is just, I think, the rate of change of the pupil itself. I don't know if some of that's also like the nervous system adjusting to kind of different levels of light hitting your retina, and then stimulating your nerves to send information to your brain. There are some time delays. Like if you stare at something for a long time and close your eyes, you still see like an artifact, kind of the inverse of what you were seeing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some other factors at play there too. But your pupil is that first order like controlling function. And in a camera, you have what's called an aperture, which essentially is an internal, usually entity that you can change the size of. You can change the amount of area that light is allowed to pass into the camera through an aperture control, so that you could again get the right amount of light hitting your film or hitting your digital image sensor. So other things that are interesting is if we're focusing, then it turns out the physics is that you can only focus you can optimally focus objects that are a certain distance away and have them be perfectly in focus with an optimal lens. And the reason for this is if you think of objects that are like super far away, like infinitely far away, like think stars and galaxies, by the time the light emanating from that object reaches us, we're looking at such a tiny fraction of the light that came from it. All the light rays are essentially hitting our eye in parallel. And so that's called like a view at infinity, like it's an object that's infinitely far away. And so you're taking these parallel rays, and then your lens is focusing them down to one point. And so you have to bend the rays a certain amount so that they come in parallel, and then they all converge down to one point on your retina. On the other hand, picture something very close to your eye that has light emanating out of it in all directions. Those light rays are sort of still spreading out as they hit your pupil. The ones near the top of your eye are going more upward. The ones hitting the bottom of your pupil are kind of going more downward. The ones to the left, to the left, to the left, to the right.
Yeah.
So it's like,
okay. Less not so parallel.
Yeah, they're not parallel. There's like a cone, an expanding cone, like is hitting you from a single point. And so now your lens has to bend or refract those rays more. If the rays were coming in parallel, they have to change direction a certain amount to sort of form a cone and hit a single point on your retina. When they're coming in spreading out, you have to bend them, call it twice as much, but frankly, just more in order to focus them. And so, like when you're reading something that's close to your eye and it kind of feels difficult, like that's your eye
Yeah.
muscles, like sort of squeezing your lens to like make it essentially bulge more in the middle. So it has more refractive effect to bend that light further to bring that near thing into focus.
Okay. All right.
And in the background, the things that are further away are a little bit blurry because
Yes.
their light rays are more parallel when they get to your eye.
So they get bent out of parallel.
Yes, they get bent, well, past actually. So they'll bend and they'll actually converge, but they'll converge at a point before they get to your retina, and then they'll have started to diverge again.
And then they spread again.
Yes, exactly.
Oh my goodness. So the focal point is not on your retina, it's in front of it.
For those distant objects.
Yes, which is, I mean, I've heard this, this is like the macro effect on your camera that cameras can fake nowadays with filters.
Bokeh. Yep.
I've also heard it called bokeh. Yeah,
Yes.
it's like, what is that? BOQU?
I think it's BOKEH, but
Yes, that's right. And we love that.
yeah, it looks so cool.
Right. And it's like, I've always wondered why I find that so aesthetically pleasing. And I think it's because it makes my mind feel the same way it feels when it's examining something very closely. It's like I
Yeah.
hold like a marker up in front of my face and I focus on the marker just a few inches in front of my eyes, and everything else behind it blurs into the background. And we love that.
Yeah.
We love that feeling. It's like I'm focusing. I don't know.
Yeah.
Why is it weird?
Yeah, no, I hadn't thought about the psychology of that because there's an artistic beauty to it, but yeah, maybe there's this psychology that we all desperately crave focus and the like reduction of noise in the background, and so it's like a visual equivalent of that
Yes.
experience.
It at least feels familiar. It's like
Yeah.
I recognize that,
Yep. And so yeah, I'm actually just thinking about some of this in real time. And so as you focus on something that's very close to you, the background's going to blur. And then the inverse happens if you're focused on something very far away, where you're only bending parallel rays to a point on your retina. Objects closer, their diverging light rays that are hitting your eye are not bent enough. And so they would actually focus some distance behind your retina if they could get there. And when they reach your
Right.
retina, they're
Yeah.
still somewhat defocused or haven't fully converged, and that's why those objects in the foreground will appear blurry when you're looking past them.
So let's talk about blur.
Okay.
What is blur? Like, I understand what focus means. It means that light rays are converging on a small enough point. Or really, it's more like an area, right? But
Yeah.
I guess from a light, my mental model is incomplete here, but they are focused into a small point. Why is it then when light rays from a single object do not converge on your retina, either in front of it or they converge instead in front of it or behind it? Why is it that we see what we see? This like lack of edge detection, like edges they spread out, right?
Yeah.
Finer details merge color and shape with the neighboring fine
Yep.
details. Why is that? Like, what? I don't quite have a mental model to explain why the lines not converging on that point create that perception for us.
Right. Yeah, so let's start by I want to do this in two steps. Like, let's start by thinking of that. What did you call the like image reverser, like the camera you wore on your head for that class?
Yeah. Honestly, I didn't tell you the full name because I can't remember it, but it was an acronym with like 6 letters.
Nice.
It was like AOPMEU. It was like the Amazing Optical Something Mechanical Eye Unit or something.
Right on.
I can't remember. Anyway,
Right on.
it was called. We pronounce it OPMU.
OpMu.
This is going back 30 years. It's amazing that I even remember it. But yes, that was the OPMU.
Okay.
Like, TM.
So yes.
Patent pending.
So the OpMu, your like self-built camera, it had you said a piece of paper or something that you were focusing the image onto. And so the goal of focusing is for every point outside of it, that you're looking toward, all the light that's coming from that point that's reaching your lens and coming through your lens and coming through your aperture, which your lens was inside of, converges back to a single point on that piece of paper.
Mm-hmm.
And if so, then when you look at the paper, it's going to look sharp. And
yeah,
if we were to replace that paper with an image sensor that's going to measure how much light is hitting each point on a grid on that sensor, then 2 points on that image sensor that are next to each other are going to receive distinct inputs, one say from a line and one maybe from like a white space nearby. And so that'll also
Okay.
appear sharp when we look at it. And if it's in your eye instead, the exact same thing's happening. You have individual, in the center of your eye, mainly cone cells, which give you your fine visual detail. And if each of those cones is receiving light that's sort of exclusively from a separate region of the scene you're looking at, then like you'll perceive like I'm looking at, I see some plants and there's like some gray behind them. So where the plant is, I see green, and then there's a very sharp edge, and right next to it is gray. And that's because certain of my cone cells are getting the green light from the plants, and other cone cells are getting the gray light from the background.
Okay.
If, on the other hand, the light from the plant that I'm looking at was not focused, but instead, keep in mind that light's coming out of that plant going in every direction, and it's hitting, and so individual rays of light from that edge of that plant are hitting every part of my lens coming through my pupil. If some of that green hits a bunch of different cones in an area, like instead of making like a dot, it sort of makes like a big circle, and there's more in the center and there's less at the edge. So it's kind of a circle that fades toward the edge.
Yep.
And then right next to it, the gray background is sending light rays through, and those are also not fully converged to a point. They're more like a circle, and those circles overlap.
Yes. Okay.
And so the cones in the overlap area get some gray and some green, and then kind of outside the overlap, there's some green on one side and some gray on the other, but there's no like clear edge or boundary between them. That is what blur or defocus look like, whether it's us looking at that piece of paper that we have a defocused image on, or our camera sensor, or our eye itself, our cones and rods, just not each sampling a unique place in the image, but in fact getting all this overlapped information.
That makes so much sense to me. And the idea of overlapping circles that are kind of spreading to neighboring cones in a blurry image, I can see how that turns into what I perceive as blur.
Yeah.
Visually.
And I suspect that if you were to take like a digital image, which is a grid of individual like color and intensity values, and you were to do the same thing, in fact, like a blur kernel, it's called, the kernel just being a little like computational process you can apply to something. Essentially, you say, for each point, take that value and put some fraction of that value onto all the neighbors, and maybe their neighbors and maybe their neighbors. And you can create essentially a blurred image by a relatively simple just smearing of the information across all the adjacent pixels.
Yeah, it's like the simplest one would just be averaging, right? Where you take a given pixel in the source image and you replace it with the average of all of its neighboring pixels within a certain radius.
Yep.
And then move on and repeat that for the next image, pixel and so on.
Yep, exactly. And then a slightly more sort of tuned version of that is you do a function that takes the neighboring pixels, but it weights them inversely according to their distance. So the further the pixel is, the less it contributes. And then you get like a really sort of normal looking blur.
Right.
There's a classic one called a Gaussian blur, where you essentially that shape is based on that.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. The function is a bell curve instead of a linear average, right?
Yep, which is just the result of essentially a statistical sampling process saying, well, what's the chances that a light ray coming from that object hits the center if it was perfectly focused, or hits one of the ones kind of around it, like throwing darts at a dartboard or something.
Yeah. And that makes sense to me. And it must, because Gaussian blurs, going back 20, 30 years ago when I was first experiencing different blur functions, Gaussian blurs looked the most natural to me.
Yep.
And it stands to reason that our cells probably have a similar power law, or like a similar function that describes the drop off in their perception of light based on how it gets defocused as it comes in. There must be some like very similar function happening in your eye.
Yeah, and it wouldn't surprise me if that's a natural effect, even just of what a lens that's not perfectly focused ends up doing, is you get that sort of a Gaussian sort of power distribution in terms of like the quantity of light rays that hit center versus various distances off target. I haven't looked at that in a while, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah.
Those functions seem to show up everywhere.
Yep.
So now that we've talked about that, it then leads to kind of the next thing, which is, well, what's the other extreme? Like, what's the most in focus we can make something? And if we take our digital camera metaphor, the most that you can really perceive in terms of detail would be if each of those image sensors has like a unique intensity value. Like let's say you're looking at like sharp edges or like a grid of like light and dark lines, dark lines with light spaces in between them. I don't know if we've talked about digital signal processing yet, but I'll say intuitively that image sensor and our cones are the same way, our rods are the same way as the picture elements in a digital camera sensor, which is each of those elements can only measure one thing at a time. And that means that if we want to detect like edges or changes in objects or structures, we need adjacent sensors to perceive the structure between them, as opposed to like one of them being able to tell like, oh, I'm actually seeing like a mix of light and dark, or I'm seeing a certain pattern here. Like one cone can't identify an emoji.
Yeah.
Or that cone can only detect, hey, am I seeing like something on a range from light to dark, and what color is it? And that's it. And so if we want to detect an actual image, each of those cones has to sort of detect its own picture element, and then we combine all of those in a mosaic effectively in our brain to actually see the structure of the world that we're looking at. And digital cameras do the same thing. They have these individual picture elements that can capture essentially like the intensity of one color at that point in space, and then we put all of those elements back on our screen, which is projecting those individual colors and intensities. And then, of course, the funny part is that light comes to our eye, where we once again essentially digitize it. Like we capture it back as individual, in this location on our retina. Currently, the light is this intense or this bright. And then our brain takes all of those inputs and turns them back into our perception of an image of the real world.
It's so awesome. And I got to tell you, Shane, like this is one of the parts of the body where I go, yeah, that is digital.
Yes.
And I'm always hesitant to say that because I read an article a few years ago that just it really opened my eyes to how human beings are constantly searching for metaphors to describe how the human body works, especially the brain.
Yeah.
But not just the brain, And one of the things the article said was that, hey, when steam power was coming out, like locomotives and machines and the Industrial Revolution,
Yep.
there was a lot of hypothesizing that the body operates on pressures. And it was like fluid pressure and steam pressure inside the body are what regulate the body. They're what cause you to be able to move.
Yeah.
And the brain must have pressures in it as well, because obviously pressure is like propelling the Industrial Revolution, so it must be what's going on inside our mind.
Yep.
And so when people say, well, the brain is like a computer, I'm like, I wouldn't be so sure about that.
Right.
Like, I don't know if we really understand that as well as we think we do. And so far, every metaphor we've used to describe the human body that comes from something we've invented has been wrong.
True.
But this one seems right. The retina, the cells that live on your retina and perceive little quantized chunks of light and color in a matrix of sorts.
Yeah.
And then transmit that information back to your brain individually feels digital to me.
Yeah, it certainly feels like digital sampling. And I think all the processing and integration that's happening is probably beyond our understanding. But you're right. Like, it does seem that these are discrete sensors. And as we talked about in the last 2 episodes, the crazy thing is each cone has its own role in color perception, and it's only by combining them that we truly perceive diverse color, because our brain has to look at the difference or the ratios between them to figure that out. And so they're responsible for spatial sampling, like where is something on the retina, which translates to where is it out in the scene we're looking at, and the light intensity and the color itself. And it really does seem like they're each doing this job individually, and then there's this integration function. And maybe some of the integration takes place in the retina, maybe some takes place in the optic nerve, maybe some takes place in the visual cortex of your brain. I haven't looked into that, so I wouldn't claim to know where that integration's happening. But from a sensing standpoint, it does really seem like it starts as, if not digital meaning numeric, I'll call it at least discrete.
Discrete, yeah, that's a good way to say it. That's safer.
Yeah, spatially discrete. It's in the spatial domain. It seems to be that it's a discrete function, meaning it's individual elements, as opposed to a continuous function, which means like anywhere along it, you could sort of stimulate and get any perception.
Right.
It really seems and even when we talked in the previous episode about Olo, this unique green color that you can get by shining a green laser at the green oriented cones in your eye, it's taking advantage of that discrete property and targeting those discrete elements with that laser to sort of paint an image onto your retina, which your brain then perceives in this very unique color.
Exactly. And I sense, Shane, that we might be segueing now to this concept of pixels and resolution.
Yeah.
Is this a good place to go next?
I think we should. So, yeah, and I was kind of trying to find a way to get there, but it's difficult. And this is the thing, this is one of the things that just really shocked me about the way that our eyes work and our brains work, because when humans figured out digital signal processing, it was remarkable. And this is like, oh shoot, I should have looked at the history. I want to say this is mid 20th century, like Bell Labs. There were some people that studied information theory and signal processing. So Claude Shannon is considered the inventor of information theory. And Harry Nyquist is credited with figuring out how we can apply discrete processing to continuous signals and do it with full fidelity. And so he essentially figured out, like, you don't actually have to measure something, and they were looking at things like sound transmission for telephones. You don't have to look at every instant of that signal. You only have to measure it so often, and as long as you measure it often enough, you'll be able to recreate every signal up to signals that change faster than you measure, essentially, is the way it works. And specifically, he said that if a signal oscillates at a certain frequency, as long as you measure it at twice that frequency or more, you can actually fully recreate the signal, as long as your measurements were very accurate.
Meaning collecting discrete samples.
That's right.
That are twice as often collected as the highest frequency in the signal.
That's right. Then you can fully recreate the signal. And this is actually, like, to me, this was like a miracle, because it's what allows computers to process real world information and not just numbers we feed it. And to do it in a way that's highly useful and high fidelity. And it's not obvious to me that this should work until you understand that it does. But if someone said, if someone said, oh, to fully process something, you have to measure it infinitely often to trace the exact curve that it follows over time, like, I would have believed you.
Yeah, that's intuitive to me.
Yeah, I would have believed that.
And that's probably true. Well, let's see here. So immediately I think of map making, like the phrase, the map is not the territory.
Yeah.
Which means the map is an approximation of the actual territory that it's mapping. What would it take to have a map that can actually fully represent the territory? Well, whatever the frequency of change is along the territory lines that you're measuring, your map would have to have double the samples of that frequency per unit of whatever distance along, say, a border.
Yeah, that's spatial frequency, which is a unit of distance. That's right. And so this is where it breaks down. So let's go straight there. Let's go to the hard part first. If you've heard of fractals, do you know the history of, like, who first sort of identified fractals and described them and what they were trying to do?
Well, the name that springs to mind for me is Mandelbrot, but that's probably not the one you're thinking of.
I think it might have been him, actually. But the task was trying to measure the length of the British coastline.
Oh, okay.
And the problem is the length of the British coastline is totally a function of the size of ruler you're using to do the measuring.
In other words, you could, I mean, literally, if you're down to, like, the atomic level, you can wrap a tiny ruler around many little atoms.
Yep. Exactly.
One atom at a time. Each atom has 3 rulers worth of sides you can go around it.
Yep. And this is the problem, is they said, oh, if I measure the British coastline using, a 10-kilometer ruler, I get a certain number, but I can tell it's not perfect.
Yep.
So what if I use a 1-kilometer ruler? Well, I get a bigger number. The coastline's longer.
Like, is it a lot bigger?
Yeah. And the problem is, if something's smooth, as you measure it, like, say the circumference of a circle. If you measure the circumference of a circle using, like, an inscribed triangle or a circumscribed triangle, you get a number. Then you use a square, then a pentagon, a hexagon. As you make better polynomial fitting, which is basically smaller edges, so a better ruler, you will find that your measurements converge on the actual circumference of the circle.
But the circle is smooth, and it actually has a finite length.
Yeah, well defined. Yeah, 2 pi r, or pi times diameter. On the other hand, if you do this to the British coastline, every time you make the ruler smaller, the total measured length of the coastline, if you're following, the seashore, it goes up. And as I think it was Mandelbrot that was doing this, he realized it wasn't converging. Like it wasn't like approaching some certain number, just getting closer to it. It was literally like getting bigger by like, I don't know. I'm going to pick something like you cut the ruler size in half and it increases by 20%. If you cut it in half again, it increases by 20% again. I'm just making up the numbers. This ratio is important.
We get the point.
It's called fractal dimension. So there's actually some math behind it. But it means that an infinitesimally small ruler, like you would use in calculus, is going to have an actual, like an infinite length of measure.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the definitions of a fractal.
Which is like, it's amazing because all the accountants are just going, look, we already knew the answer. Yeah. When the royal government asks you to measure the coastline, you just ask them, how long do you need it to be?
That's right. And then you can derive the ruler that you should use.
We'll give you the right ruler, we'll measure it, and we'll give you the exact number you need.
Exactly. So this actually points out the flaw in all of this, and that is that I said that if you know the maximum frequency that you're trying to capture, then you have to measure it double that frequency. And so what's going to happen if you're trying to make a map is if you're measuring the British coastline, any finite ruler you use is actually losing information, but it's capturing all the detail up to twice the length of the ruler, essentially, is going to be fully captured. So that's the caveat we have to apply there. So
the resolution of your measurement is that.
That's right.
Is that one way to say it?
Yep. And so the same thing applies for image processing and actually for sound processing, any signal processing. And so, for example, when you record, again, it started with the telephone and they said, well, we only need to capture human speech. And so they just cut off all the high frequencies, which is why like the old hold music you listen to sounded so terrible.
Yeah, and why you can't tell the difference between the letter S as in Sierra and F as in Foxtrot.
Exactly, because that relies on high frequency that just wasn't captured by the phone system. And, today we could argue about whether, compact discs or vinyl records have better fidelity, which might come down to how well they capture very high and low frequency sound waves outside of what's, captured well in the digital medium. But back to the visual perception problem, we have the same thing going on, which is changes that happen in the image, like light to dark to light, that are smaller than can be perceived by adjacent pixels or sensor elements will actually be lost. And they'll just blur together to look like one thing.
Okay.
And so it's the same rule, essentially, which is you have to capture at double now the spatial frequency or rate of change with your individual picture elements. And this is what ends up defining the finest degree of detail that you can perceive with your eye. And it's down to the density of the cones in your retina.
Nice.
Because adjacent cones have to see something different in order for you to perceive that difference.
So 2 things here. We really do see the world in pixels.
Yep.
That is real.
Yep.
And number 2, there is actually a limit to how fine or how high of a resolution of our own world we can perceive. Not talking about pictures on the screen.
Yep.
Just looking out your window.
Yep.
There is a limit on how high of a resolution you can perceive.
That's right. And again, there are multiple factors that contribute. Like your focusing has to be good enough. And for those of us that are nearsighted or farsighted, essentially that's where our point of focus is at the wrong spot. So if you're nearsighted, your point of focus ends up inside your eye, essentially. And so you do really good. Like it's a little bit too much light bending happening and your eye is sort of too long. And so most things that are far away, they actually converge before they hit your retina. If you're farsighted, it's the opposite.
And so they look blurry?
And if you're farsighted, it's the opposite problem. The near objects, you can't bend the light quite enough to hit your retina, and so they focus behind. So that's the first thing. We actually have to be able to focus point sources of light down to points on our retina. But if we do that, the next limitation is actually that density of individual cones in our eye. And it's actually a relatively small area in the center of our retina, an area called the fovea, or fovea centralis, where you have the maximum density of cones for that most detailed resolution or perception. And then as you move away from that, the density actually drops off quite a bit. And you have much less detail in like your periphery or even a little bit away from center.
Oh, wow.
But in the very center is where we have our best acuity, our best accuracy of vision. And that's what, of course, when we're studying an object or when we're reading, like that's what we're looking at with our eye to discern like the individual letters or the individual elements of whatever we're looking at. And, medical professionals, eye doctors have a term they use when they describe, actually there are a number of terms, but the one that we commonly hear when we talk about how good your vision is, what's the term, Dave?
20/20.
That's right. So that's the US term. It turns out the rest of the world that uses the metric system has 6.6.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So
Okay.
20/20 means that you perceive at a distance of 20 feet the same level of detail that a typical person perceives at a distance of 20 feet.
Okay.
So the first number is what you perceive at a certain distance. The second number is what a typical person perceives at that distance.
Okay. Typical meaning like a healthy functioning eye.
That's right. Yeah, on the good side. And we call it perfect vision, though our actual, like when you're young and you're using both eyes, you often can see about twice that. So you'd have what you might call 20/10, where you can perceive at 20 feet what, again, a healthy person would have to be 10 feet away to see, so you're seeing it at twice the distance.
Yeah. And I remember someone we knew like that, Shane. One of our former coworkers at a company we worked together had some kind of eye surgery. And as a result, he would use his computer screen with just the tiniest little font.
Oh, yes.
And do you remember this guy?
I do remember this, yes.
Anyway, shout out to Eric from like almost 20 years ago. But I remember walking by his desk and being like, wow, I thought I used a small font.
Right.
That is small.
Yeah.
And he's like, yeah, I just had LASIK.
Exactly.
Like, that's awesome.
I have bionic eyes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that comes down, again, to your ability to focus, which is what the LASIK is addressing, but also that density of perceptive elements, specifically the cones in your fovea, and their ability to discern the individual areas of light that are hitting them. And again, the reason people outside the US call it 6.6 is because they do 6 meters. So you're detecting at 6 meters what someone else would detect at 6 meters, which is roughly 20 feet. And in terms of the actual spatial density of cones, it does seem like there's about a factor of 2 available at most, which is that you could perceive at 20 feet what someone else would have to be 10 feet away to see. And essentially, when you're twice as far away, it means that the two objects are like the two lines with white in between them that you're trying to discern on the eye chart. Essentially, the width of all those features is inversely proportional to the distance. So when they're twice as far away, all those objects are half the size, which means if they're perfectly focused, they're hitting half the area on your retina. And if you were to go another 20 feet away, like you're trying to see what somebody can see at 5 feet and you're at 20 feet, those elements that they're able to discern at 5 feet are now like the light and dark areas of those elements that are discernible at 5 feet are maybe barely discernible at 10 feet. At 20 feet away, they're so squished together, they're actually hitting the same cone, the light and dark parts of that object.
Oh.
And so you just can't tell them apart anymore.
Okay. Yeah.
So there's a spatial sampling limitation to this. And the rough number is at 20/20, you're perceiving entities that are approximately 1 arc minute apart, if I remember right. So like 1/60th of a degree in a 360-degree circle. So pretty small. And people think that if, again, about the maximum, like the narrowest distance that your adjacent cones can distinguish is about half an arc minute. So 1/120th of a degree of arc is what you can actually sort of tell apart when you're looking at things perfectly.
So that's the resolution. I guess that's independent of how far away the thing is you're looking at, right?
Yeah. So this is the crazy thing. Again, your lens's job is to accommodate whatever distance the thing is, make its light rays converge back to a single point. And so your retina's job is truly just spatial separation, which is purely a function of the angle of those light rays going from your lens to the retina, which is exactly sort of mimicking the angle of the light rays coming from the object to your lens.
I'm sitting here looking at a computer screen.
Yep.
And taking what you say here, these principles, to their practical application. If I'm looking at text on the screen,
Yep.
the thin lines that compose the letters in this text have to be, at my distance from the screen, they have to be wider than half an arc minute
That's right.
in order for me to perceive them.
Yep. And the closer they are, the closer they can be together because it's proportional. The further away they are, the bigger they can be.
Mm-hmm.
An extreme example is like you go to a sporting event and they have this massive screen, and if you're far away, it actually looks pretty good.
Like the resolution looks good, right?
Yeah, you'd be like, oh, I see a nice clean image. And as you get close to it, you realize like the individual picture elements on that, the light bulbs are huge.
Yeah. I have an example of that. The biggest example I've ever seen is I went to Las Vegas and walked up to the Sphere. Have you seen this thing?
Yes, and actually I had the same experience, but yeah, tell me your experience here.
Well, I walked up as close as I could to the exterior of the building, which from a distance, from like a mile away, looks like this high resolution, amazing image. But when you walk up to that thing,
Yep.
the pixels, the so-called pixels, are like the size of hockey pucks.
Yes.
And there's probably 6 inches between them.
Yes.
It just blew my mind.
Yeah.
How big they were and how spaced out they were.
Yeah, and I think we talked to color, like if you take a magnifying glass to like a piece of printed paper or to a screen, you can see these individual elements sometimes. And yeah, the Sphere is my favorite example because I had that same thing. Like when you're driving past it, and you're a mile away, it looks incredibly detailed. And when you get close to it, you like your head can fit.
It looks terrible.
Yeah, and you can fit between two of the picture elements. Like,
yes.
you've totally ruined it.
How does this work? And it's all because it's half an arc minute, and so you get to choose by being far away or close to it
Exactly.
how your eyes perceive that.
Exactly. So this leads to one more thing we can talk about, and then we're probably both about done. And that is going back to you talking about computer screens. So as graphics producing systems, engineers have to think about how these are going to be perceived by their viewers. And this is where there've been, as the technology has improved and screens, it used to just be like, we're happy that we could see something discernible, even if we could see like the blockiness or the individual pixels. And then screens kind of got to, I'll call it like a good enough phase where they all looked pretty good. And I remember the first image I saw that actually looked like a photograph was like in the 90s. There was something called VGA and then Super VGA.
Oh, yes. Oh, man, I haven't heard Super VGA in a long time.
And I remember going to the North Dakota State Fair and seeing a Super VGA monitor for the first time. And it blew my mind because it was the first time that it actually looked like a photograph being reproduced.
Yeah.
Because the pixels had gotten small enough, I think more to fall below that 1 arc minute threshold.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you could still perceive the pixels.
Yeah.
For sure, right? Even at a not super close distance, like maybe a foot or two away, you knew you were looking at a pixelated image.
Yeah, but it was pretty good. And there were 2 things that happened. The other was that they actually had like decent color depth. So prior to that, a lot of images only had like 16 or 64 colors they could show at one time.
Yeah, very limited color palette.
Yeah, and finally they could show like full, at least 16-bit color, which would be like 16 million colors, or full 24-bit color. Actually, which would be 16 million. Sorry, 16-bit would have been 64,000 colors. But still, lots of colors, enough to actually be interesting. So that was like a big step forward for display technology. And skipping through a whole lot of history, the next big step in display technology, I'm going to claim came, at least credit goes for marketing this, goes to Apple.
Yes. Credit for the name.
Yeah, and I'm sure there are people who are like, I've already doing this and Apple stole my idea. It's a story as old as time, or at least as old as that company. But they came up with something they called a retina display.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of the retina display was finally the pixels in the device held at a typical viewing distance are considerably smaller than that typical limit of human visual perception, meaning they were going to be at that half arc minute or below at typical viewing distance. Is basically how Apple ended up defining a retina display.
Which is like actually a good definition, I think.
It is.
Because it's saying like your retina can't perceive higher resolution than this.
Yep. So there's kind of no point, honestly. And unless you're like I don't know if there are visiophiles like audiophiles that are like, oh, I can hear all the overtones in my vinyl records. I want more analog light hitting my eye. Maybe.
So I can hold it really close and put it under a microscope.
Yeah, I have amazing. My lens is so flexible. I can focus at 2 inches away, and I want to see it.
Yeah.
But when they first came out with Retina, there actually was a little controversy. A, I think they may not have been the first to do this, but B, their definition of like visual acuity was maybe a little weak. But over time, it got to that like sub half arc minute. Like, yes, you're really not gonna see the difference in adjacent pixels here, and it's true. Those displays look beautiful at that point.
Yeah, there's basically no, as long as it's an app that takes advantage of their high resolution, which is almost all apps nowadays, but wasn't when it first came out. But as long as that's the case, the closest I can put my eye to the screen, I still cannot distinguish individual pixels. And if I go closer, it just gets blurry because now my lens can't actually can't focus those light rays.
Yep, exactly. Can't bring those light rays and bend them enough to actually focus them. So yeah, they've essentially gone to where our computer-based digital imaging process now has exceeded the Nyquist limit needed to deliver essentially an image to our eye that is imperceptible to us in terms of lost detail. Like, our eye is simply not capable of perceiving more detail than that image is delivering, which is pretty incredible. It means like we can properly digitize our human experience and then return it back to us in a way that feels totally real.
And what's kind of amazing about this is that digital media on the screen is pretty new within the last 50 years or so.
Yep.
But print media achieved this a long time ago. In fact, the very first print media achieved this because they simply carved and molded the print die to stamp the letters on the paper.
Yep.
But even digital printing achieved this much, much earlier as well, like where you would have publications that were printed on paper with machines that could print photographs.
Yeah, that's true.
And so it's kind of interesting that and I guess it makes sense because like laying down ink very close to each other in small dots is probably a fundamentally easier engineering problem than creating 3 glowing LEDs of different intensities close enough together and close enough to the neighboring set of 3 that you beat the Nyquist rate.
Yeah, the printing was a high precision mechanical process versus the high precision like digital process, which really it wasn't until we had really efficient, I guess, LEDs, light emitting diodes that are on integrated circuits and printed circuits that we could finally make. And then even just the sheer amount of data processing to do this in real time, like maybe to make a static image using like transmitted light that's beyond, call it retina level, would be one thing, but then to do it at an adequate speed. So the other thing is, again, I haven't actually studied why, but for animations to look smooth to humans, we need them at like at least 60 frames per second. We really prefer over 100 frames per second. Short of that, you can perceive like the kind of blockiness in the movement.
Yep.
And so you really had spatial frequency and time frequency and color reproduction, which just is a massive amount of data, which has only been recently available to be processed.
Yeah. Incredible.
So yeah, you think about, okay, that's all just to like fully fool the human visual perception. We've
right.
After 80 years of computer progress, we finally got there. It's crazy just how advanced our native systems are.
And it is incredible. I like how you broke the problem down into 3 parts. You have the spatial sampling, you have the time, like frame rate sampling, and then the color sampling. And it's interesting because engineers had to beat all 3 of those systems.
Yep.
And some of the ways they defeated those systems were pretty creative, especially on the color side.
Yeah.
It's like, we've talked about this before, but your computer screen does not emit yellow light.
Yep.
It does not emit brown light.
Yep.
It only emits red, green, and blue at different intensities. And so, we beat the human eye and brain into thinking it's perceiving one thing that it actually isn't. And that's super cool. And then when it comes to motion, same thing. It's like there does appear to be some frame rate going on in the brain, right?
Mm-hmm.
By virtue of the fact that we can simulate continuous motion with discrete images flashing on the screen fast enough.
Yep.
So we beat that. Engineers beat that too.
Yeah.
So cool.
Yep. And in each of those, we're pushing the limits. So retina displays to try to get beyond the spatial resolution. And if you think about digital video, we went from 480p to HD to to 4K and beyond, and then the frame rates, like old film
Yep.
was shot at like 20 frames per second.
Yeah.
Of course, now we expect things to be 60 plus frames per second. And then on the color side, we now have HDR, high dynamic range, because that typical, since the 1980s, 1990s, 8 bits per pixel doesn't actually give you enough range from light to dark and enough increments on the way. You only have 256 increments that you can use. And our eyes do prefer a little bit more than that. Like, that was good enough to look good, but if you want it to be like totally imperceptible, you actually need a broader range from light to dark and more steps in between.
Yeah.
And so that's probably the next thing that's going to happen is more HDR, and then more, call it, high gamut display and capture devices. So like your screen will be able to have brighter brights, darker darks, and maybe a broader range of colors as well over time.
The chronology of these technologies arriving on the mass market is kind of surprising to me, the order in which they came, but I think I've got this right. I would say that from my own experience, the color was the first one to become where your human mind could only perceive it as continuous. Like you said, yes, HDR is incrementally better than like the 8 bits per color channel that we have that we've had for years. But realistically, like 8 bits per color channel, pretty freaking good still. I mean, it probably beats most people's perception.
Yeah, and we achieved that. I mean, I remember it, early 90s, late 80s, and then we've stuck with it for a long time, like for 30 years.
Decades.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, 24-bit images where you had, 8-bit red, 8-bit green, 8-bit blue for 24 bits per pixel were just the best. And frankly, like a photograph displayed on a screen like that, I really probably honestly couldn't even tell the difference between that and an HDR image that's got a higher resolution and bigger breadth. And that's been the case for decades. And then going in the chronology, so color was first, and then the second one I'm going to say was the spatial.
Okay.
So like the retina display. And that's not to say that it didn't exist, that the frame rate problem hadn't been beaten at that point in time, but on the mass market, it wasn't.
Yeah.
And like, nowadays when you buy a computer monitor or a television, they'll advertise it as 100 hertz plus or 120 hertz.
Yep.
Or some, I've even heard some that are going, did I see a 240? I may have.
I think so. I've seen some graphics cards for gaming that target 240.
And so, but the fact of the matter is that 100 plus is already higher than it's probably more than 2x our sample rate of our own internal systems that are sampling. You're right. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But the point is that I believe it was the last to achieve mass market adoption and defeat the human eye was frame rate.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I was just curious how fast is our reaction time to a visual input? And yeah, I'm just looking. This is saying, just quick search, maybe quarter second, maybe a tenth of a second. So yeah, if gamers are like, 120 frames per second isn't good enough, I need 240 so that I can be faster.
Yeah, it's like, I doubt it.
Yeah, I doubt it as well.
Unless they have a lot of midichlorians in their blood. And then maybe.
That's right. Maybe then. And again, yeah, be kind of the equivalent of, at some point, it just feels smooth and continuous, and it no longer feels discrete. And I think that's the really cool thing about each of those three processes is each of them, when they're too slow or too low fidelity, you can tell that they are discrete processes.
Yes.
Whether it's in space or time or in color. And then once you get above our either time constant or spatial constant or like sort of level determination, thresholds, they seem continuous. And it actually goes back to the math from the Nyquist-Shannon digital sampling theorem, which I think is super cool.
That is really cool. And maybe the most amazing part to me is that our own minds cannot distinguish that indeed there are discrete processes happening inside there.
Yeah.
We know that because there are discrete rod and cone cells.
Yep.
So we know that's for sure true.
Yep.
The rest of it, I don't know. It's like harder to make for me, it's harder to make as strong of a claim on the other two, on spatial or spatial, yes, and then frame rate and color perception. It's harder for me to say, but it's discrete. And when I look around the world and I say, oh, that leaf, I'm going to look at that. It's so smooth. There's no way my brain can detect that there's any discrete math happening at all.
I just was thinking about something, though. Do you know how do you pronounce it? Moire, a Moire pattern?
I've always said moire.
Okay. It does have an accent on the E.
I wonder if that's just because I was thinking of the eel.
Moire or something. Moire. It's probably French.
Moire, yeah. I just did a little Wikipedia pronunciation.
So you know how that like looks to us like this weird pattern it's basically when you're overlapping intersecting lines that are kind of at a slight angle to each other, and we perceive it as having like a wave pattern or something in it.
Yes, but it's not. It's just discrete lines that overlap.
Yes, I suspect that the way we perceive that is a function of our digital spatial sampling system.
Interesting.
Because if the lines were like thin enough and overlapped in the right way, I wonder if you would just you should be able to perceive like, oh, they're distinct down to the very point of intersection. But what you end up seeing is these sort of areas where they appear to like be sort of smeared together. And I wonder if that's because of the limited detection in our own visual system.
Oh, yes. That's your brain tricking itself into thinking it's seeing something continuous, but it's not.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Your brain's like, well, what's the simplest explanation for this? Surely not that there's this crazy pattern of overlapping lines.
Yeah, exactly.
It's probably something
Which
else.
doesn't occur in nature.
Yeah, exactly. Very rarely. And I noticed this, like, if like someone's wearing striped clothes, like sometimes my eyes sort of get a weird vibe from like striped clothes, and they're like sort of get these visual disturbances, which now I'm wondering either in like the cones or like downstream processing, some part of my brain is like trying to fit it to like something that makes sense, and it's confounding it because of the high frequency information in it.
Yes. Very interesting.
Okay, one last thing for you, Dave, just to bring this around to other engineering decisions people have made. So we talked about retina displays. There's another standard out there that sort of the retina display goes sort of in contrast to, and it's something you and I both deal with in the way that the World Wide Web and computer systems have standardized image and text display. And there's essentially a defined reference-sized pixel, and this shows up in various places. And I thought it was really interesting when I was looking into this to find, well, what is that particular pixel definition? And you can't actually know how far away somebody is looking at your screen, but you can guess, or you could say, well, typical viewing distance would be such. So the standard reference pixel for the World Wide Web is defined as 1/96th of an inch, so 96 dots per inch, another way to put that, at a viewing distance of 28 inches. So roughly like, an arm's length.
All right.
And again, 96 dpi is kind of a standard printing process density, and an arm's length is a standard distance to look at something. And I suspect that's not a coincidence. Like, people kind of got to where like, okay, that looks good on paper. If you make it better than that, sure, it's nice, but it's a lot more expensive and hard to do. So let's call it good at 96 dpi.
Mm-hmm.
And if you actually go look at it, that ends up being about 47 pixels per degree. So call it like what, 1.2 arc minutes. So like it almost hit our exact spec of 1/60th of a degree. Is 1/47th of a degree.
Okay.
And so anyway, just random piece of trivia that kind of comes back around to this whole thing, which is it does map quite well to our actual, call it 20/20 vision in terms of spatial determination.
Very interesting. And for those following along at home, when Shane talks about this reference pixel, we're no longer talking about hardware.
Yeah.
We're talking about the size of something that you would measure on the screen. And for web developers out there, this is how CSS defines its pixels.
Yes, exactly. And so it's just a standard. And then if you have a retina display, your retina display says, oh, I actually can fit a 2x2 grid or a 3x3 or a 4x4 grid of my display pixels into that one reference pixel. And that's how you can get, again, those really fine details that are going to look really good to your users, because it's actually, again, finer than even the base specification of what kind of the minimum image standard would be, or text or whatever you're displaying.
So interesting. Really cool. This is yet another example where software had to adapt its definitions because of advances in hardware.
Yep.
People have been using the term pixel forever to specify positioning things on the screen. It's definitely on web pages, but also in other places. And suddenly Apple mass markets a Retina display where that number is now off by a factor of 2 or 3
Yep.
if they just go by hardware. So they're like, okay, sorry, pixel no longer means hardware pixel. It now means 1/96th of an inch.
At 28 inches viewing.
At 28 inches away from
exactly.
the eye, yes.
Yeah.
It now means 1/47th of an arc minute or whatever,
Yeah.
whatever we said.
Yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, if you're looking at the outside of the sphere, you're like, well, where's my reference pixel? Well, it's that hockey puck on that kind of mesh on the outside. But when you're half a mile away, it looks great because it's back down to that, that single arc minute or whatever. So viewing distance a lot larger, pixels bigger as well.
Exactly. Super interesting. Well, Shane, we had some explaining to do. Did we do the explaining?
I think we did the explaining, Dave.
Well, I know you certainly did, and I appreciated it. It was great to hear from you, and I loved this topic. It was fantastic.
Yeah, good to talk to you as always, Dave.